The courthouse in that small American town had never held so many people at once. It was an old red brick building, weathered by decades of trials, divorces, land disputes, and minor criminal hearings. But this case was different. Long before the doors opened that morning, a crowd had gathered on the courthouse steps, clutching newspapers and whispering about what they might witness inside. The moment the bailiff unlocked the heavy wooden doors, reporters swarmed in, their cameras clicking like a storm. Spectators' neighbors, church members, and even teachers from the local elementary school filled the benches. They came not only for justice, but also because curiosity had gripped the entire community. At the heart of it all was a child, 3 years old, with pigtails tied neatly by her mother that morning. She looked impossibly small in the oversized witness chair. Her legs dangled above the floor, swinging nervously, her tiny shoes scuffed from play. She clutched a stuffed rabbit to her chest, its ears chewed from comfort during countless sleepless nights. To the packed courtroom, she looked less like a witness and more like a fragile reminder of innocence. Her mother sat only a few feet away, in the gallery behind the railing. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes glistened with a mix of pride, fear, and sorrow. She wanted desperately to shield her daughter from what was about to happen, but knew the little girl's words might be the key to securing justice. The defendant sat at the other side of the room, his lawyer whispering in his ear. His expression was unreadable, cold, almost calculated. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, just looking at him. The girl, however, didn't glance his way. She stared instead at the polished wood of the bench, her stuffed rabbit pressed tightly to her chest. The judge presiding over the trial was not easily swayed by emotion. With 35 years of service, he had seen hardened criminals, clever liars, and desperate pleas. But even he could not ignore the weight of what was about to unfold. A 3-year-old child, perhaps the youngest witness to ever take the stand in this county, would be asked to speak about events far darker than anything a child her age should know. When he entered the courtroom, his black robe trailing behind him, the gallery rose in silence. He adjusted his glasses, surveyed the room, and took his seat with practiced authority. Yet, when his gaze fell upon the girl, something softened. He cleared his throat and reminded those in attendance to remain silent and respectful throughout the proceedings. His gavel struck once, and the trial resumed. The prosecutor had fought hard to allow the child to testify. Many argued she was too young to remember, too fragile to withstand the pressure. But the prosecutor believed otherwise. Children might stumble over details, might mix up times and places, but their honesty was often unshakable. They had no motive to lie, no strategy to manipulate, only truth, raw and unfiltered. To ease the girl's fear, the judge had allowed an unusual accommodation. The presence of a police dog. The door at the side of the courtroom opened, and Ranger entered. A German shepherd with a coat of black and tan. His stride was steady, his demeanor calm. Unlike the patrol dogs trained for aggression, Ranger had been trained as a comfort animal for child witnesses. He had attended therapy sessions, accompanied children during interviews, and provided silent strength in moments when words were too hard to say. As soon as Ranger patted across the floor, the girl's eyes lit up. She reached out with her free hand, releasing her grip on the rabbit just enough to pat the dog's head. Ranger sat obediently at her feet, his steady presence like an anchor in a storm. For a moment, the tension in the room eased. People in the gallery exchanged glances, marveling at how the child's small hand resting on the dog's head seemed to steady her entire body. Still, unease lingered. Everyone in the room knew how fragile this moment was. One wrong question, one burst of confusion, and the testimony could collapse. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, confidence practically radiating from him. He had handled cases like this before, and knew children could be unpredictable. He intended to exploit that unpredictability, planting seeds of doubt in the jurors' minds. If he could show she was confused, if he could make her falter, then her words would lose their power. The prosecutor, however, knew better. He had prepared carefully, limiting his questions to only the simplest truths. He didn't need a full story from her, only clarity in the moments that mattered. The courtroom's wooden clock ticked loudly, each second amplifying the silence. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens poised above notepads. Jurors adjusted their posture, bracing themselves. Even the judge, usually stoic, leaned forward slightly. The child hugged her stuffed rabbit closer, her knuckles turning white. Her gaze flickered briefly to her mother, who gave the smallest nod of encouragement. The little girl took a breath, steady and slow, her hand still resting firmly on Ranger's head. It was in that moment, before a single question was asked, before a single word was spoken, that the courtroom felt the weight of history. Every person present knew they were standing at the edge of something unforgettable. The truth, perhaps ugly and heartbreaking, would soon come from the mouth of the child. And as the judge raised his gavel to signal the start of testimony, silence fell so deep that even the hum of the courthouse lights seemed to fade. The girl looked up, her eyes wide but steady. Ranger shifted slightly, pressing his shoulder against her leg, as if to say, "You're not alone." The courtroom, once filled with whispers, now held its breath. For all the chatter in the courtroom, there was one undeniable truth. Without the little girl, there would be no case. The police had gathered evidence, yes, photographs, reports, testimonies from neighbors who had heard shouts through thin apartment walls. But none of it carried the crushing clarity of an eyewitness. Unfortunately, the only eyewitness was 3 years old. She had been in the house that night. She had seen the shadows, heard the screams, and felt the terror no child should ever know. Though too young to understand the legal weight of her presence, she carried the truth inside her like a lantern in the dark. Still, not everyone trusted that lantern to burn brightly. Lawyers debated endlessly in the weeks before the trial. Some argued her words would be unreliable, that her memory could easily be reshaped by suggestion or fear. The defense latched onto that idea, insisting a child that young couldn't separate fact from imagination. "She's a toddler," the defense attorney scoffed during pre-trial arguments. "She believes in Santa Claus and monsters under her bed. You expect a jury to base their decision on her?" The prosecutor didn't flinch. "Yes," he replied simply, "because she knows the difference between someone who loves her and someone who hurts her." That was when the judge made his ruling. The girl would be allowed to testify, provided the environment was made safe and non-threatening. The decision sparked debates across the community. Some praised the courage of giving her a voice. Others worried the trauma might be too much for her. The courthouse itself became the stage for a battle larger than any single case. It was about whether truth could come from a child's lips. Day of her testimony arrived, and the courtroom hummed with nervous energy. The bailiff opened the side door, and the little girl entered with hesitant steps. She clutched her stuffed rabbit so tightly, it seemed like part of her. Her shoes squeaked faintly against the polished floor as she was guided to the witness chair. The prosecutor bent down, smiling warmly, and helped her climb up. Her feet dangled, unable to reach the ground. Murmurs swept across the gallery, but the judge silenced them with a single gavel strike. "Order," he said firmly. "This witness deserves the same respect as any other." At first, the child's gaze darted around the room, wide-eyed and overwhelmed. The wooden benches seemed endless, filled with unfamiliar faces. Jurors stared with a mix of sympathy and doubt. Reporters hunched over their notepads, every pen ready to capture her smallest movement. She froze, shrinking into her chair, until a sound shifted the energy completely. The heavy click of claws against wood. Ranger entered again, steady as a shadow. The German shepherd walked at the handler's side, his ears alert but not aggressive. His eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on the little girl. The handler gave a soft command, and Ranger padded over, circling once before lowering himself at her feet. Her shoulders instantly relaxed. The stuffed rabbit in her arms loosened, and she stretched out her small hand, brushing her fingers through the thick fur at his neck. The change was subtle but undeniable. She was no longer just a scared toddler on display. She was a child with her protector. The jury noticed. The reporters noticed. Even the judge leaned back slightly, watching the transformation unfold. Children, the prosecutor knew, carried honesty like oxygen. They might not remember every detail or recall exact times, but what they did remember often rang with a purity adults couldn't replicate. They didn't calculate, didn't strategize. They just told you what they saw, what they heard, and how it made them feel. The defense attorney didn't see it that way. He leaned toward the defendant, whispering sharply. His strategy depended on painting her as unreliable, and yet even he couldn't ignore the weight of the moment. A small child drawing strength from a dog, sitting in the very chair most hardened criminals avoided. The girl's mother, sitting only feet away, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. She had seen her daughter cry in the night, wake from nightmares, and cling desperately to that stuffed rabbit. Watching her now, stroking Ranger's fur, was like watching a flower push through concrete. Fragile, yes, but resilient in ways no one expected. The prosecutor cleared his throat softly, signaling the start of questioning. He was careful not to rush. His voice dropped low, gentle, almost like speaking to a skittish bird. "Do you see your friend, Ranger, here with you?" he asked. The girl nodded, her lips twitching into the faintest smile. "Is he helping you feel safe?" She nodded again, this time pressing her hand firmly against Ranger's back. The dog didn't move, his eyes fixed forward, but his presence radiated strength. The prosecutor smiled, then stopped. That was enough for now. He knew better than to overwhelm her with rapid questions. Every small acknowledgement built a foundation, preparing her for the harder truths. The defense attorney rolled his eyes, scribbling a note on his pad. To him, this was theater, a charade designed to tug at jurors' emotions. He was certain the child would crumble when real questions came, but others in the room saw something different. They saw a child facing down a sea of strangers with nothing but her stuffed rabbit and a loyal dog. They saw a community's hope resting on a voice that hadn't even learned to spell her own name. The judge adjusted his glasses again, peering down at the girl. For the first time in his long career, he felt an ache in his chest he couldn't quite describe. He had sworn an oath to the law, to impartiality, to evidence over sentiment. And yet, as he watched the child's small hand stroke the police dog's fur, he realized this trial was no longer just about statutes and procedures. It was about courage. The gallery remained silent, sensing the fragility of the moment. The air seemed to thicken, every breath heavier than the last. Outside, the town bustled with normal life cars honking, children playing after school, but inside the courtroom, time slowed to a crawl. The little girl tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. Ranger's ears flicked once, his chest rising with a deep breath. Her grip on the stuffed rabbit loosened further, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, her shoulders straightened. It wasn't just the presence of Ranger. It was the knowledge, deep down, that someone believed her, that her voice mattered. And in that fragile, trembling silence, the unlikely witness prepared herself to speak. The defense attorney had built his reputation on dismantling witnesses. He was tall, immaculately dressed, and spoke with a confidence that filled every corner of a courtroom. In his 20 years of practice, he had cross-examined doctors, police officers, and hardened criminals, breaking them down piece by piece until jurors were left doubting everything they had heard. And now, he was facing a 3-year-old girl. To him, it wasn't cruel, it was strategy. The law was a battlefield, and every witness was an obstacle to victory. This child was no different. In fact, he considered her the weakest link in the prosecution's chain. If he could show the jury she was confused, inconsistent, or too young to understand the difference between truth and imagination, the case would unravel. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his legal pad as he watched the little girl on the stand. Her legs dangled, swinging nervously above the floor. One hand clutched her stuffed rabbit. The other rested protectively on Ranger's back. The sight made some jurors soften, but the defense attorney only smirked. He had seen sympathy before. Sympathy was fragile. Logic, he believed, was stronger. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, rising from his chair, "with the court's permission, I'd like to begin my cross-examination." The judge gave a cautious nod. "Proceed, but remember the witness's age. Keep your questions clear and appropriate." The attorney adjusted his tie and approached the stand with calculated patience. His footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor, each one deliberate, each one meant to emphasize authority. He stopped just short of the witness box, lowering himself slightly so he wouldn't appear to tower over her. To the jury, he wanted to look like a patient teacher guiding a child through harmless questions. "Good morning," he began, his voice soft but edged with precision. "You've had a long day already, haven't you?" The girl blinked, uncertain how to respond. Ranger shifted slightly, leaning into her leg. She stroked his fur, grounding herself. The attorney gave a reassuring smile. "I just want to ask you a few questions. That's all. Can you tell me how old you are?" She held up 3 fingers. "3," he repeated, nodding. "Such a big girl already. Do you go to school yet?" She shook her head. "Not yet, of course." "You're a little young for that." He paused, glancing at the jury as if to remind them just how young she was. "Do you play games at home? With dolls or maybe pretend?" The girl hesitated, then gave a shy nod. "Of course you do," the attorney said warmly, his tone dripping with calculated charm. "All little kids do. And when you play pretend, you sometimes make up stories, don't you?" The prosecutor immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor," leading the witness. "Sustained," the judge said firmly. Though his eyes narrowed at the defense attorney. The lawyer bowed his head slightly. "Apologies. I'll rephrase." He turned back to the girl. "When you play, do you like to imagine things? Maybe being a princess, or having tea with your stuffed animals?" The girl clutched her rabbit tighter. Ranger raised his head, watching the attorney with sharp, unblinking eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Exactly," the attorney said, spreading his hands as if to present the obvious. "And sometimes, when children imagine things, it can feel very real, can't it?" The jury shifted uncomfortably. A few jurors frowned, sensing the trap he was laying. The attorney's confidence grew. "You know," he continued, "I have a little niece about your age. She tells me stories all the time. About dragons, about fairies, about scary monsters. Do you ever tell stories like that?" The girl looked down at Ranger. Her small fingers curled into his fur. For the first time, she lifted her eyes to the attorney, her lips trembling but her gaze steady. "I don't like monsters," she said softly. The attorney froze for a split second, caught off guard. He quickly forced a smile. "Of course not. No one likes monsters. But sometimes, when we're scared, our imagination makes things seem scarier than they really are, doesn't it?" He emphasized the word imagination, letting it hang in the air like bait. The jury leaned forward. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, ready to object again if necessary. The little girl shook her head. "No." The single syllable rang louder than expected. Ranger gave a low, quiet rumble in his chest, a sound that vibrated against the wooden floor. It wasn't aggressive, it was protective. The dog's eyes locked on the attorney, and the girl's shoulders straightened. For the first time, the defense attorney felt a flicker of unease. He cleared his throat, shifting slightly on his feet. His plan had been to paint her testimony as a child's fantasy, no different than fairy tales. Yet the firmness in her tiny voice, backed by the steady presence of the dog, unsettled him. He tried again. You know the difference between when you're awake and when you're dreaming, right? Sometimes dreams can feel real. The judge interrupted, his voice sharp. Counselor, watch your line of questioning. She is 3 years old, not a psychology student. A ripple of laughter moved through the gallery, quickly silenced by the gavel. The attorney's jaw tightened, but he forced another smile. He turned back to the girl, determined to regain control. You love your mommy, don't you? The child nodded instantly. And your mommy loves you? Another nod. Sometimes, when we love someone very much, we want to make them happy. We want to tell them what they want to hear. Isn't that true? The courtroom tensed. It was the heart of his strategy to suggest her words weren't her own, but planted by a desperate mother. The girl's eyes darted to her mother, who sat frozen in the gallery, tears shining in her eyes. Then the girl looked down at Ranger. The dog licked her hand once, slow and steady. No, she whispered again, louder this time. I tell the truth. The jury stirred. A woman in the front row pressed her hand to her mouth. The attorney straightened, masking his frustration. He had expected tears, confusion, maybe even silence. Instead, he was met with resistance, not in the form of anger or argument, but in the quiet strength of a child who refused to be bent. For the first time in his career, the defense attorney felt his carefully constructed strategy slipping from his grasp and across the courtroom. The prosecutor watched silently, knowing the real battle had just begun. The courtroom had grown tense after the defense attorney's failed attempt to rattle the child. The weight of silence pressed on everyone, the jurors, the lawyers, the reporters scribbling frantic notes. Even the gallery, filled with neighbors and curious onlookers, barely breathed. The little girl, sitting in that impossibly large chair, clutched her stuffed rabbit with one hand and Ranger's fur with the other. The judge, watching from his bench, adjusted his glasses. He had seen countless witnesses falter under cross-examination. Some crumbled in tears. Others lashed out in anger. Yet here was a 3-year-old child, nervous, trembling, but still steady in her insistence that she would tell the truth. He tapped his gavel lightly, not in reprimand, but to draw attention back to the bench. His eyes softened, a rare departure from his usual stern demeanor. Little one, he said, leaning forward just slightly. I want you to know something very important. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide, her cheeks flushed. You are not here to answer complicated questions, the judge continued, his voice gentle, almost grandfatherly. You are not here to say what anyone else tells you. You are here to tell us what you remember. That's all. Just what you know. Do you understand? The girl hesitated, then nodded slowly. Her grip on Ranger tightened. The judge gave her a reassuring smile, one that softened the lines of age etched into his face. And if at any point you don't know an answer, you can simply say, I don't know. That's perfectly fine. No one will be upset with you. The jury watched closely. Some leaned forward, captivated not by legal arguments or evidence, but by the raw humanity of the exchange. The prosecutor, standing at his table, allowed himself a quiet breath of relief. The judge had given the girl what she needed most, permission to be herself. The defense attorney, however, frowned. He tapped his pen against his notepad, frustrated by the judge's soft approach. It stripped away his strategy, reducing his ability to confuse the child. He knew that in this moment, the judge had tilted the balance, protecting the child's innocence while preserving the integrity of her testimony. The mother in the gallery pressed her lips together, fighting back tears. She wanted to run forward, to wrap her arms around her daughter and tell her it was okay. But she knew she couldn't. The barrier of the courtroom kept her at a distance, and so she did the only thing she could. She mouthed the words, "You're brave." The little girl saw it. Her eyes lingered on her mother's lips, then flicked down to Ranger. The dog, sensing the shift in her body, adjusted his position, pressing his shoulder against her leg. He didn't bark, didn't move dramatically. He simply anchored her in the storm, his steady presence more powerful than any words. The judge straightened again, clearing his throat. "Now, sweetheart, when someone asks you a question, take your time. There's no rush. You may answer however you wish. Do you understand?" Another nod. This one firmer dot. The judge's gaze swept across the courtroom. "And let it be known," he said in a voice that carried unmistakable authority, "that this court will not tolerate any attempt to intimidate or confuse this witness. She is to be treated with dignity and respect." The gavel struck once, sharp against the wood. The echo rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every word. Headlines were already forming in their minds. Judge defends 3-year-old witness. Courtroom falls silent as child prepares to speak. The prosecutor stepped closer to the stand. He crouched slightly, lowering his voice so that it carried warmth, not interrogation. "Can you tell us your name?" he asked. The little girl whispered it, barely audible, but the microphone carried it across the room. A hush fell again, as if even the sound of her name carried weight. "And this is your friend?" the prosecutor asked, nodding at Ranger. The girl nodded, stroking the dog's fur. "Does he help you feel safe?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice stronger now. The prosecutor paused. That was enough for the moment. He didn't need long answers. He needed the jury to see her courage. He needed them to believe her voice mattered. The defense attorney rose slightly, ready to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Counselor, sit down. You'll have your turn later." The gallery murmured softly, quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern glare. The little girl looked at the judge again. Can I hold Bunny too?" she asked, lifting the stuffed rabbit. The judge's smile deepened. "Of course you can. Bunny can stay with you the whole time." She clutched the toy tightly, pressing its worn fur against her cheek. The rabbit, though threadbare, carried the comfort of home. Paired with Ranger at her feet, it was enough to make her feel less alone in the vast, intimidating space of the courtroom. The prosecutor carefully adjusted his notes. He had planned dozens of questions, but now he set most of them aside. This wasn't about length. It was about clarity, about letting the child's simple truths cut through the complexity of the trial. Across the room, jurors shifted, their skepticism softening. One juror, a retired teacher, leaned back with tears welling in her eyes. She had spent years coaxing frightened children into finding their voices. Watching this child reminded her of every shy student who had once clung to her hand on the first day of school. The defense attorney scribbled harder, his frustration mounting. His plan depended on undermining her, but the judge's intervention had given her power. It was no longer a battle of intellect. It was a test of courage, and the child was winning. The judge gave a final nod. "All right," he said. "You may proceed, counselor." The prosecutor stepped forward once more. "Sweetheart, do you remember what happened that night?" The gallery leaned forward. The jurors stiffened. Even the defendant shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The little girl hugged her stuffed rabbit and lowered her gaze to Ranger. She bent down, whispering something against his ear. The German shepherd's ears flicked, his eyes locking on the defendant with sudden intensity. The silence was electric. Everyone knew the moment was coming. The judge leaned forward, his hands folded tightly on the bench. "Take your time," he reminded her. "Say only what you know." The child straightened, her small shoulders squared, as though Ranger's strength had flowed into her. Her lips parted, the microphone catching the soft tremor of her breath. For the first time, she prepared to speak not just as a frightened child, but as the unlikely voice that might deliver justice. And the entire courtroom, from the jury to the gallery, leaned forward as one ready to hear the truth. The hush that settled over the courtroom was so complete that even the faint hum of the air conditioning felt like a roar. Every eye was on the small figure in the witness chair. The little girl sat straighter than before, her stuffed rabbit pressed firmly against her chest, Ranger's fur beneath her palm. Her lips trembled, but her gaze, wide and unblinking, was fixed on the man at the defense table. The defendant shifted uncomfortably. He leaned back in his chair, trying to mask his unease, but the tapping of his foot against the floor betrayed him. The silence, once advantageous to his attorney, now pressed in on him like a weight. The prosecutor bent slightly at the knees, lowering his voice so it was almost a whisper, though the microphone carried it clearly. "Sweetheart, you told us you remember something. Can you share it with us now?" The girl inhaled shakily. She glanced at the judge. His expression was patient, steady, kind. He gave her the smallest nod, reminding her that she was safe, that this moment belonged to her alone. Her small hand tugged gently on Ranger's ear, as if drawing courage from the German shepherd. The dog didn't flinch. He simply adjusted, his steady body a wall of comfort. The girl opened her mouth. For a moment, nothing came out. Then, in a voice fragile but unmistakable, she uttered two words. "He hurt." The courtroom froze. The words seemed to hang in the air, reverberating with far greater force than their simplicity suggested. 2 syllables, but they cut deeper than any paragraph of testimony could. Jurors blinked, stunned. One leaned forward, her knuckles white against the armrest of her chair. Another mouthed the words silently, as though repeating them would help him process the gravity. The mother in the gallery gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled instantly, spilling down her cheeks, but she remained silent, not daring to interrupt her daughter's courage. The defendant shifted again, his jaw tightening. His attorney placed a firm hand on his arm, as if warning him not to react. But the flicker of panic in his eyes was visible, undeniable, and noticed by more than one juror. The prosecutor's throat tightened. He had prepared her for weeks, gently coaching, never forcing, reminding her that she didn't need to tell a whole story, just the truth as she remembered it. And now, in 2 small words, she had done it. He knelt lower, his voice soft but deliberate. "Sweetheart," he asked gently, "who hurt?" The child's lip quivered. Her eyes darted back to Ranger, then to her mother, then finally back to the man at the defense table. Her tiny finger lifted. Slowly shaking, she pointed Dot at him. The defendant. The courtroom erupted not with sound, but with a collective intake of breath. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but filled with shock, horror, and the undeniable weight of truth. The judge's gavel struck sharply once. "Order," he barked, though his own voice carried a tremor. "This court will remain in order." The bailiff's eyes swept the gallery, silencing whispers before they began. Reporters scribbled furiously, the scratch of pens against paper loud in the otherwise still room. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he snapped, his voice edged with desperation. "The witness is a child. This testimony disappointing its unreliable, emotional manipulation." The judge's glare was icy, cutting him short. "Sit down, counselor," he said firmly. "The jury will determine the credibility." The child's words stand. The defense attorney hesitated, then sank back into his chair, his lips pressed in a tight, frustrated line. The little girl's eyes, wide and trembling, remained fixed on the man she had just identified. Her breath came in short bursts, as though speaking those words had drained her. Ranger pressed harder against her leg, grounding her, reminding her she was not alone. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, then rose to his full height, his voice steady now, emboldened by the child's courage. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said carefully, turning slightly toward them, "you have just heard the truth. Not complicated, not rehearsed, simple, honest, from the mouth of a child who had no reason to lie." The jurors avoided eye contact with one another, each lost in their own thoughts, their own dawning realization. The judge leaned forward again. "Young lady," he said softly, his voice returning to that grandfatherly tone, "you've done something very brave today." "Thank you." The child blinked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She buried her face briefly into Ranger's fur, her small shoulders shaking. But when she lifted her head again, there was something new in her gaze, less fear, more strength. Her mother couldn't hold back anymore. Silent tears streamed down her face, her hands clasped together in silent gratitude. The defendant slumped slightly in his chair, the weight of the child's words pressing down on him more than any piece of evidence had. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but the man didn't respond. His face was pale, his eyes distant. The prosecutor, recognizing the moment, closed his folder. He didn't need another question. The girl had said all that was necessary. The judge cleared his throat. "This court will recess," he announced, his gavel striking again. 10 minutes. Bailiff, see that the witness is escorted to a safe room. The little girl slid off the large chair, still clutching Bunny, still gripping Ranger's fur. The German shepherd rose smoothly, walking beside her with the solemn dignity of a soldier. The bailiff opened the side door, and the child disappeared from the room, leaving behind the echo of her tiny, trembling voice. 2 words. And yet, the walls of justice had shifted. The gallery exhaled as if the air had been trapped in their lungs for minutes. Reporters surged to the hallway, their phones buzzing with breaking news updates. Inside, the jurors sat frozen, their eyes darting to one another, silently acknowledging that what they had just witnessed could not be undone. The defense attorney slumped in his chair, his confidence shattered. His strategy of poking holes and sowing doubt seemed hollow now, dwarfed by the simplicity of the child's truth. The prosecutor gathered his notes, his hands steady, his mind clear. The trial was far from over, but in that moment, he knew momentum had shifted. The judge remained at the bench, his face solemn. He rubbed the bridge of his nose briefly, then looked out over the courtroom. "We will reconvene shortly," he said, though his voice carried the weight of what they had all heard. The defendant stared straight ahead, unblinking. But the tremor in his hands betrayed him, and in the hearts of everyone present, jurors, gallery, even the seasoned professionals of the court, there lingered the echo of a child's courage. 2 words. Enough to freeze an entire courtroom. Enough to pierce through lies and legal maneuvering. Enough to tip the balance of justice. The moment of truth had arrived, and nothing, not even the best defense strategies in the world, could erase it. The courtroom was still vibrating from the shock of the girl's 2 words. "He hurt," simple, short, and piercingly direct. 2 syllables that carried more weight than any legal brief, more force than any photograph, more truth than the most carefully curated testimony could ever convey. Jurors leaned forward instinctively, as though drawn into the orbit of her small, trembling voice. Their collective breaths caught in their throats. Even those who had doubted the effectiveness of a toddler's words now felt the undeniable power of innocence wielding authority. The defendant, normally composed and measured, slumped in his chair. His eyes darted nervously from his lawyer to the girl, to the judge, and back again. He clenched his fists in his lap, as though trying to physically hold himself together against the gravity of what had just been spoken. The defense attorney's jaw tightened. He had prepared for days, rehearsing tactics, anticipating objections, and planning for every way a small child might falter. He had believed that confusion, hesitation, and fear could be exploited. But now, with the entire courtroom focused on her, he realized his strategy had crumbled like sand through his fingers. 2 words had undone weeks of preparation. He rose, forcing his voice into a calm tone, though the quiver betrayed him. "Your Honor," he said, "with all due respect, the witness is a child. Her testimony, her identification, cannot be considered credible. Emotional influence, parental coaching, and the inherent unreliability of a 3-year-old make this entire statement inadmissible." The judge's eyes narrowed, and his voice carried an authority that cut through the lawyer's argument like a blade. "Sit down, counselor. The witness's words stand. The jury will assess credibility. Emotional or not, the child has spoken her truth. That is all this court requires at this moment." The gallery shifted, some leaning forward with awe, others trying to digest the power of the exchange. Even the reporters at the back seemed momentarily hushed, pens poised in midair. The prosecutor, sensing the opportunity, straightened. He walked slowly toward the stand, careful not to overwhelm the child. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "you told us what happened. Can you show us who did this?" The little girl's eyes flickered briefly toward her mother, who offered a small nod, silent encouragement. Her gaze then returned to Ranger at her feet. The dog's eyes met hers, unwavering, calm, commanding without movement. She bent slightly, whispering into his fur. Ranger's ears twitched. He gave a low, deliberate growl, not threatening, but a confirmation, a signal that whatever she was about to do was right. The girl lifted her tiny hand, shaking, and pointed directly at the defendant. Her voice was barely audible, yet every ear in the room caught it. "Bad man." A collective gasp moved through the courtroom. The jurors leaned forward, eyes wide, the weight of the words anchoring in their hearts. Even the judge's stern features softened with a mixture of solemnity and gravity. The defense attorney froze. His mind raced, trying to conjure a way to regain control, but he could feel it slipping further with each passing second. 2 words had shifted the balance irreversibly. No amount of cross-examination could counteract the power of truth spoken by a child. Ranger shifted slightly, moving closer to the girl's leg, reinforcing her stance. The dog didn't bark, didn't threaten. He simply radiated authority and assurance, a living shield. The judge's gavel struck sharply, demanding order. "This court will remain in order." His voice echoed across the chamber. All witnesses, gallery members, and jurors will remember that decorum is required. Yet the courtroom's atmosphere had irreversibly changed. Every person present felt it, the raw, unfiltered truth delivered with courage no adult could replicate. The jurors exchanged glances, their skepticism replaced by a dawning clarity. Even the reporters, trained to detach and observe, felt the gravity of the moment pressing in. The defendant shifted, sweat glistening on his forehead. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he stared straight ahead, unblinking. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but the man did not respond. He could no longer rely on charm, persuasion, or legal maneuvering. The simplicity of the child's words left him exposed. The prosecutor allowed the moment to breathe. He stepped back slightly, lowering his hands. He did not rush. He knew the jurors needed time to absorb the impact. The child's courage had done what he could not, cut through every defense strategy with a scalpel-sharp clarity. The mother in the gallery clutched her own hands together, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had known her daughter's truth all along, had known the terror she had endured. But to see it acknowledged in the courtroom, to see the child's voice pierce the defenses of adults trained in law, was a moment that transcended words. The gallery remained silent, as if in reverence to the courage displayed. Even those who had once doubted, who had whispered about a child's unreliability, now leaned forward, captivated by the unshakable honesty radiating from her small frame. The defense attorney finally rose again, attempting to salvage what remained of his argument. "Your Honor," he began, voice firm, "the identification of the defendant by a child this age is prejudicial. The jury's emotions are in play, and the judge cut him off with a single piercing glance. "Sit down. You will have your opportunity, but the testimony is valid. The child has the right to be heard, and her words carry weight." The attorney sank back into his chair, scribbling furiously, trying to formulate a counter-argument. But even he felt the futility. The child's 2 words, simple and unadorned, had already reached every corner of the courtroom. The little girl, sensing the tension, hugged Ranger's fur. She inhaled deeply and pressed her stuffed rabbit closer. For a child her age, the weight of her words could have been overwhelming. But Ranger's presence grounded her. He radiated patience, strength, and protection, allowing her to remain steady, even as the entire legal system seemed poised to engulf her. The prosecutor knelt slightly at the stand. "Can you tell us what you remember next?" he asked softly. The girl's lips quivered, but she did not retreat. She lifted her gaze and looked directly at the defendant. Her tiny finger trembled as it pointed again, each movement deliberate, unflinching. "Bad man," she repeated. The jury collectively leaned forward. Even the seasoned court reporters exchanged incredulous looks. The judge's jaw tightened, though his voice remained calm. "This court acknowledges the witness's statement," he said firmly. "Order will be maintained." The defendant's face paled. His confident composure had been stripped away, replaced with stark terror. The weight of a child's honesty, pure, unfiltered, undeniable, had penetrated every defense tactic he and his attorney had prepared. The prosecutor allowed the moment to linger. He didn't need additional testimony yet. The child had spoken, and the impact was profound. Ranger shifted slightly, pressing closer to the girl. She leaned into him, drawing courage from his calm, unwavering presence. The two acted as one, child and protector, innocence and authority intertwined. The gallery exhaled collectively. Some whispered prayers under their breath, others dabbed tears. Everyone present recognized the magnitude of what they had witnessed. It was rare, almost unprecedented, for a child to possess such clarity and courage in the face of overwhelming fear. The judge's gavel struck again, punctuating the room with authority. "The court will take a brief recess," he announced, "to allow the jurors, witnesses, and gallery to regain composure. We will reconvene shortly." The little girl, still clutching Bunny and Ranger, descended from the stand with gentle guidance from the bailiff. The German shepherd remained a steadfast presence, never leaving her side. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters surged into the hallways, already drafting their accounts. Conversations buzzed with disbelief. A 3-year-old had frozen an entire courtroom with 2 simple words. 2 small syllables had carried the weight of a truth too heavy for adults to bear silently. Inside, the jurors sat in stunned contemplation. Every glance at the defendant reminded them that the balance of the trial had shifted irreversibly. 2 words, spoken with courage and clarity, had begun to shape the verdict in ways that no amount of legal maneuvering could undo. The defendant sat motionless, hands clenched, as the full impact of the child's testimony sank in. His attorney whispered urgently, but even he could sense that the tide had turned. The judge observed quietly, recognizing that this was no ordinary trial moment. He had presided over countless cases, yet rarely had the courtroom experienced a silence so profound, a truth so unassailable, delivered by someone so small. 2 words. The courtroom would remember them forever. they were enough to freeze an entire room, to shift the course of justice, and to demonstrate the power of truth in its most innocent form. And for the little girl, in that moment, they were enough to prove that courage does not depend on size, age, or experience. It depends on the heart. The jury sat in near silence, still absorbing the weight of what they had just witnessed. 2 words. He hurt. Simple. Yet in their brevity lay devastating clarity. Every member of the panel felt it deep in their gut, a truth no adult testimony could rival. Some jurors closed their eyes briefly, trying to process the gravity of the moment. One retired schoolteacher, who had spent decades guiding frightened children, dabbed at the corner of her eyes, whispering a silent prayer for the little girl's courage. Another juror, a young father, gripped the edge of the bench, his mind flashing to his own child, imagining the fear and innocence that had just been laid bare before him. The defense attorney tapped, his pen nervously against his notepad, the sound louder than he intended. His carefully built strategies seemed to evaporate before the reality of the child's unwavering truth. He had anticipated hesitation, confusion, the unpredictable faltering of a 3-year-old. Instead, she had spoken with precision, with conviction, and with the kind of clarity that left no room for doubt. The defendant's posture slumped further. His confident composure, once a shield, had melted away in the face of her words. His eyes darted to the gallery, searching desperately for some sign that the child might be wrong, that the words were exaggerated, rehearsed, or misinterpreted. There was none. Ranger, ever vigilant at her feet, remained a constant presence, an unspoken reassurance for the child, and a subtle psychological barrier for the defendant. His stillness, his unwavering gaze, conveyed more authority than any adult could muster. The judge, sensing the profound impact on the jurors, leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the bench. "I remind the jury," he said, his voice firm but calm, "that your duty is to weigh all evidence carefully. Do not allow emotion alone to dictate your judgment. But do recognize that truth can appear in many forms, sometimes in the smallest voices." The gallery shifted, acknowledging the weight of his words. But inside, each juror was already grappling with an undeniable realization. The child's courage had pierced the courtroom's defenses like a sharpened blade. The prosecutor allowed the silence to linger. He knew the moment was delicate, powerful. He did not rush to fill it with more questions. Each juror was processing, each one internalizing the significance of what a 3-year-old had just said. Some jurors glanced toward the gallery, catching the mother's silent tears and the small, steady figure of the child leaning against Ranger. Others focused on the defendant, now visibly shrinking under the weight of a judgment that had begun before the final verdict. One juror, a man with decades of experience in law enforcement, whispered quietly to his neighbor, "I've never seen testimony carry this kind of impact. Not even from grown witnesses." His neighbor, a nurse, nodded. "There's a kind of truth in children," she replied. "It's raw, unfiltered. It pierces through all the noise adults add." Across the room, the defense attorney scribbled furiously, trying to craft a rebuttal that might salvage credibility. But deep down, he knew there was no rebuttal strong enough to dismantle the power of innocence, aligned with courage. Every tactic he had prepared seemed trivial against the sheer force of the child's conviction. Defendant's shoulders trembled. His gaze darted nervously between the child and Ranger. The dog's calm eyes held a silent warning, a barrier of unwavering vigilance that left the man feeling exposed, stripped of every ounce of confidence. The judge's gaze swept the courtroom, lingering on the jurors. "This case," he said softly, "is unusual in many respects. But the law demands we consider all credible testimony. Today, we've heard something that will not easily be forgotten. I urge you to focus, to deliberate with fairness, but also with recognition that truth sometimes arrives from unexpected places. The jurors sat silently, absorbing the statement. They had been trained to look at evidence impartially, but the human element, the courage of a 3-year-old child, was impossible to ignore. It weighed heavily on their minds, shaping their perception of the defendant in ways no photograph or document ever could. In that silence, the gallery seemed to hold its breath. Even reporters paused, pens hovering above their notepads. The entire courtroom had shifted in tone. The child's testimony had transformed it from a procedural exercise into a moral reckoning. The little girl, guided gently by the bailiff and ranger, returned briefly to her seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She was small, fragile, yet her presence was immense. She had spoken, she had declared truth, and the courtroom had responded in kind. The defense attorney rose again, trying one last angle. "Your Honor, I request a recess to consult with my client," he said, his voice tight. "It is clear that the jury's judgment may be influenced by emotion rather than fact." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Granted," he said, though his tone left no room for argument. "But let it be clear that the jury's deliberation is guided by law, evidence, and credible testimony, which includes that of all witnesses, regardless of age." As the recess was called, murmurs rippled through the gallery. Spectators whispered to each other, exchanging astonished looks. A 3-year-old had managed to dominate the attention, control the courtroom's focus, and direct the moral weight of judgment with nothing but 2 words. Outside the courtroom, reporters crowded together, phones out, typing rapidly. Headlines were already forming in their minds. Toddler freezes courtroom with 2 words. German Shepherd witness anchors child's testimony. Justice comes in unexpected forms. Inside, the jurors were escorted to their deliberation room. There, expressions were a mixture of awe, gravity, and intense focus. They knew that the child's testimony could not be ignored. 2 words had crystallized the essence of the case in a way that no other piece of evidence could. Defense attorney leaned toward the defendant in a low whisper. "We need a strategy," he said urgently. "The child has left an impression we can't counter with logic alone. You need to stay calm." But the defendant was silent. His hands trembled, eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless, dominated not by an adult opponent, but by the unwavering clarity of a child. Back in the courtroom, the gallery gradually emptied, the whispers of astonishment lingering. Spectators spoke quietly among themselves, sharing disbelief and admiration. One mother whispered to her friend, "She's braver than most adults I know." Ranger remained at the child's side, a steadfast sentinel. Even as the courtroom cleared, his presence reminded everyone that courage could manifest in unexpected ways, and that truth was sometimes delivered in forms too small to anticipate. The judge returned to his bench after the recess, observing the emptying gallery with a quiet nod. He had seen the impact. He knew the jury had been affected. But as always, he maintained a balance, ensuring that procedure and law guided the next steps. The prosecutor gathered his notes, his mind steady. He did not need to instruct or coach. The child had done what no one else could, delivered her truth with precision, courage, and clarity. He merely had to guide her through the final moments of testimony, allowing her innocence and honesty to complete the story. Even as the defense strategized, the courtroom's energy had shifted irrevocably. The child's simple courage had created a moral force impossible to ignore. Every person present, juror, lawyer, spectator, felt its weight, and it was clear that the trial had entered a phase where truth, bravery, and clarity would determine the outcome. 2 words. They had frozen the courtroom, shifted the moral compass, and revealed the power of untainted courage. The jurors, now in their deliberation room, sat in quiet contemplation. Each reflected on the child's words, on the unwavering presence of Ranger, and on the undeniable proof that even the smallest voice could carry the heaviest weight. The defendant remained silent, trembling in his chair, while the defense attorney's mind raced with dwindling options. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted, and outside the courtroom, the town would never forget the day a 3-year-old girl, armed with nothing but her truth and a steadfast German shepherd, altered the course of justice forever. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. The seats creaked under the weight of anticipation, every movement magnified by the tension that still hung in the air. Outside, spectators pressed their faces against the glass, eager to witness the conclusion of a trial that had captivated the entire community. 2 words spoken by a child had frozen a room, and now, the decision of 12 adults would seal the fate of a man who had underestimated the power of innocence. The little girl sat in the witness chair again, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly, Ranger sitting obediently at her side. She had been escorted gently back to the stand, and though her small frame trembled, her eyes were wide, aware that something monumental was about to unfold. The judge cleared his throat, signaling the gravity of the moment. Members of the jury, have you reached a unanimous verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a calm yet determined demeanor, rose slowly. Her hands shook just slightly, betraying the tension that had built over hours of deliberation. She took a deep breath and nodded at the judge. We have, Your Honor. A wave of hushed anticipation swept the courtroom. The defendant stiffened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of his chair. His attorney whispered rapidly, offering last-minute advice that seemed almost futile in the face of what had already occurred. The judge nodded at the foreperson. Please proceed. The woman stood straighter, her voice steady, carrying across the courtroom with clarity. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged. The words struck like a thunderclap. A collective gasp swept through the gallery, followed by murmurs and quiet cries. Some spectators wept openly, their relief palpable, while others simply stared, stunned by the gravity of what they had witnessed. The defendant sank into his chair, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time in the trial, he looked genuinely powerless, stripped of every attempt to evade accountability. His attorney lowered his head, knowing that no strategy could undo the child's testimony. The judge's gavel struck sharply, demanding order. Order in the courtroom. His voice, firm yet measured, commanded attention. The room fell silent immediately, all eyes turning toward the bench. This verdict is recorded. The court thanks the jury for their service. The little girl, still holding her rabbit, looked at Ranger and whispered, We did it. The dog's ears flicked in acknowledgement, and he pressed his shoulder against her leg, steadying her. The words were simple, but the courtroom seemed to feel the depth of them. The mother rose slowly from her seat, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't rush to her daughter. The courtroom's rules held her back. Instead, she mouthed the words, I'm proud of you, and the girl's eyes met hers, shining with shared triumph and relief. The prosecutor allowed a quiet smile, feeling the weight of justice delivered. He had guided the process, protected the child, but in truth, it was her courage, her steadfastness, that had secured the verdict. He took a moment to appreciate the complexity of the moment, a courtroom frozen in awe by a 3-year-old's honesty. Outside, the spectators buzzed with excitement and disbelief. Reporters hurried to their phones, typing breaking news headlines that would circulate for days. Toddler's 2 words freeze courtroom. Justice anchored by courage and a German shepherd. Community witnessed bravery. Beyond years. Inside, the defendant was escorted out, his hands cuffed, his expression a mixture of disbelief and defeat. He cast one last look at the little girl, and in that brief glance, there was recognition. He had underestimated the power of truth, courage, and innocence. The defense attorney followed, head bowed, aware that this loss was more than a professional defeat. It was a moral reckoning. The jury had spoken, and no amount of legal expertise could reverse the impact of two simple, truthful words. The judge leaned forward, his expression softening. To the young witness, he said, voice gentle but resonant, your courage and honesty have played a crucial role in ensuring justice. You have reminded us all that truth comes in many forms, and that bravery is not measured by age. The girl blinked up at him, her lips trembling slightly. Ranger nudged her hand, encouraging her to stand tall. She gave a shy smile, a mixture of relief and pride shining in her eyes. The bailiffs guided the spectators out, and the mother finally made her way to her daughter. She knelt, embracing her gently. You are so brave, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The little girl hugged her tightly, holding her stuffed rabbit in one hand and Ranger in the other. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the impact lingered. Lawyers, jurors, and spectators alike carried the memory of the child's courage, a reminder that even the smallest voice can carry immense power. Outside, the media waited, but the mother shielded her daughter from the cameras. She's just a little girl, she said softly. Let her be. Ranger remained by her side, alert and calm, his presence a protective barrier against the intrusion of the world. In the following days, the community would reflect on the trial with awe. People spoke of the girl's courage, the steadfastness of the German shepherd, and the rare moment when innocence, clarity, and bravery converged to alter the course of justice. The prosecutor, who had guided the process, wrote in his personal journal, justice is not only found in evidence and procedure. Sometimes it is found in courage, in innocence, in the unwavering truth of a child who refuses to be silenced. The defense attorney, though defeated, later admitted quietly to a colleague that he had learned a rare lesson. No amount of preparation can counteract unadulterated truth when delivered with courage. And the child? She returned home with her mother and Ranger, unaware that her bravery had captivated a courtroom and a nation. To her, it had been simple. She told the truth, and the bad man could not hurt anyone else. Her stuffed rabbit rested safely in her arms, Ranger at her feet, and a sense of quiet triumph filled her small world. She had faced adults, authority, and fear, and had emerged stronger than anyone could have predicted. 2 words. They had frozen a courtroom, shifted the scales of justice, and demonstrated that courage, no matter the size of the person wielding it, can resonate far beyond the moment in which it is spoken. The town would talk about it for years. Headlines would repeat, articles would analyze, and people would tell the story over and over. But at its heart, the story was simple. A 3-year-old girl, a loyal German shepherd, and the bravery to speak the truth, no matter the consequence. Justice had been served, not through eloquent arguments, not through evidence alone, but through the unshakable courage of a small child whose voice could not be silenced. And in every heart that heard the story, a quiet lesson remained. Truth, when paired with courage, is unstoppable.